Hi guys, so this video is going to cover, well, I've broken it down to categories. We have essential, 5 of essential tools that I consider essential, 5 really useful tools, and then 5 bonus tools. And now it's going to take a bit of time, we're going to get right into it. And of course, this is just my preference. We all have our own tools that we love or that we use more, depending on what we're repairing, what we're doing. But this is just mine. Let me know in the comment section below if you would change anything, maybe you'd swap categories around, or items from each category. So we'll get right into it. First one, I think it might surprise a lot of people, digital multimeter. I love a digital multimeter. It's such a great diagnostic tool, and you can't really use it you can't use something else to really replace it. I use it on, for example, capacitors. I want to check the capacitor will take a charge, hold a charge and discharge. I want to check primary and secondary windings inside coils. Even things like resistance within switches. It was only the other day that I had a switch failing on my bandsaw, and I was able to check the resistance of it, and it was where there was corrosion that was built up between 2 points and we were having issues. This really helped, and it also confirmed that what I had done had reduced the resistance. And then of course, if we have wires that are accidentally, or the sheath of a wire is breaking, it's going to ground, it can tell you that. It's just a really useful tool. Grab one, highly recommend it. Next one, pressure and vacuum tester. I couldn't decide whether this one or the multimeter was more useful. It's tricky, but I put this second because you can fabricate something from home, you can make things work, but really this is an essential tool, especially for 2 strokes, but also 4 strokes too. Of course, we can check the crankshaft oil seals, and we can see if they're leaking. We can check gaskets, fuel lines, impulse lines, manifolds. We can check the needles in carbs of seating. It's just a tool that is so useful. It's such a great diagnostic tool. You don't have to buy a MightyVac. You can get cheaper versions, but I think it's great. I like the fact that it can be replaced. Parts can be replaced on the MightyVac. A tachometer. Now, this was a really expensive one, and it can do, or it has multiple different settings. It's not really necessary. Generally, just a basic tachometer is absolutely fine, and I think it's a great tool. I don't think you should rely on a tachometer. I think you should listen to what the engine is telling you, but it's just great. It's a great assistive tool, or one more tool to add to your arsenal. And of course, if we're running engines too fast, you're just going to end up blowing them up. So great tool to have. I consider it essential, but I also think use your ears and use the 2 together. Inline spark tester. Again, sometimes you can get away with it, but it can save a lot of trouble. The spark tester really comes into its own when you want to test spark under compression. Sometimes, and I've found this before, an engine or a coil can make enough energy to produce a spark, or for a spark to jump a gap in atmospheric pressure. However, when you put it under compression inside a cylinder, it's much harder for that spark to jump a gap. So having this tool, the inline spark tester, you can leave the spark plug in place, you can put the tester in, and you can actually see if it's sparking under compression. You may be driving yourself around the bend thinking it's got spark, when actually under compression it hasn't. That sometimes goes back to using the digital multimeter, not so much for modern coils that have circuitry within them, but the older points and condenser style, or the coils that go with points and condensers that are literally just windings. These 2 can really be useful together. Then we have a torque wrench. Torque wrenches I consider essential for certain aspects, or certain uses, for the simple fact that, especially the older engines that I find myself working on, the torque specs don't necessarily or aren't necessarily ideal, because the amount of times that nuts and bolts, or mostly bolts, have been gone in and out of threads, and you've kind of weakened the thread as such, they'll no longer take that same torque, and they oftentimes don't really need it. For example, if we're putting on, I don't know, something onto a case, or a carb or something, you really don't need that much torque. And a little bit of Loctite, a little bit of, you just use your common sense, I think is a much better way of gauging torque for general hardware. The reason why this is essential, or I put this in the essential category, is there are certain things that you just really want to make sure are correct. Of course, cylinder head bolts, absolutely. Always use a torque wrench on them. But really important as well is not just making sure something is tight enough, or at least the correct torque in terms of the obvious things. Flywheels, we don't want them coming off. Cylinder heads, we don't want them coming off, etc. Clutches, we don't want them coming off. But where we put just a tiny bit too much torque, where things can then flex and create an air leak, I think they are awesome as well. So it was just recently, I was working on a saw, and the manual specifically suggested it needed to be a really accurate torque, because if you go a bit more, as I said, it's kind of like a mounting area for the carb. If you put a bit too much torque on there, the mount can actually deform and then you can create an air leak. So really useful. I actually think T-handles, the majority of the time, are a superior option for general hardware that isn't absolutely essential, simply because you get much more feedback from a torque from a T-handle, for example, than you would the leverage that you'd get from a torque wrench. And sometimes, more often than not, in my experience with the older equipment, I've ended up stripping threads more with the torque wrench than I have with a T-handle. One thing I'd suggest is stick a bolt in a vise, torque it up to, I don't know, or go with the T-handle and get a feel, say 5 Newton meters. Find out what 5 Newton meters feels like. Find out what 7 feels like. Find out what 10 feels like. Generally, I go by 3 Newton meters is just snug, just lightly snug, where it seats and it's fine. If I want 5, I'll go lightly snug and 1/8. But of course, this is all, everyone's slightly different. We'll have slightly different feels, so practice it yourself. 7 Newton meters is snug or lightly snug, and then 1/4, and then kind of 10 Newton meters is basically where I'm putting full kind of as much as this can take, really, before I start to feel that there is a possibility of it breaking. Again, that's very subjective, so it's really important that you test it for yourself, use these two together to start with, and then you'll get a much better feel for what you can do. And you will feel when something feels like it's nipped up just right, and that will be just fine for a lot of the nuts and bolts that we'll use. Of course, essential things, it's always worth using a torque wrench. And again, if we are snugging up cylinder head bolts and we strip them because we take them to the torque that they need to be at, well, it's probably just as well it's stripped. We can put some thread inserts in there and we're good to go. Much better to take it to the right torque for those instances where things like flywheels could otherwise fall off, or cylinder head bolts could loosen, you get an air leak. You kind of get where I'm going with that. I think it's a great tool. I think it's worth investing in a decent quality set. 1/4 and 1/2, I think are really, 1/4 and 3/8, I think are really useful. All right, now we move on. We're going to go quick. These are useful tools. Impact driver. I love an impact driver. I use it all the time, and I think a little bit of common sense goes a long way with these tools. I think that in certain circumstances, they're excellent. I think that taking off things like flywheels and clutches where you don't want to be using certain style piston stops, I think they're brilliant. I think, in fact, more damage is caused by rope and piston stops than they are with impact drivers for taking those sorts of things off. Simply because you're using the compression of the engine as resistance for the impact driver. Whereas if you're stuffing rope in there, which I do a lot, especially for tightening things up, this is more for undoing things, it can get caught inside the transfers, it can get caught inside the exhaust ports. And obviously a metal piston stop, if the nut is a bit stiff on there, you can end up damaging the piston. And I've seen that 2 or 3 times on recent builds. Get yourself an impact, get a cheap one. You don't need an expensive one for small engine, vintage engines. No, let me start that again. You don't need an expensive one for small engines because the torque is so small. I mean, maybe we'll go up to an M8 on a flywheel nut or a clutch nut. And less is more, really, for this. We're using small hardware. So cheap one, much easier to, you're much more likely to strip out a thread if you're not careful using an expensive one, because generally they've got a bit more torque. Yeah, they've got a few other features, but go cheap, couple of $100 bucks. That's Australian. You can do a lot, and I think they're a really great tool to have. Propane? Butane? Propane. I think it's a propane. Propane torch, Matte Pro. Get a good quality one. Get benzomatic. I've used a few different ones and I always end up taking them back because they don't start, they don't work. Really frustrating. Get a good quality one and you'll find that you're using it all the time. The amount of times I've loosened nuts, excuse me, nuts and bolts with one is these two, 50-50 acetone and ATF and heat go together so nicely, but especially heat. I also use it for taking out bearings, installing bearings. I've also used it for larger areas, soldering on slightly thicker material. Also modifying tools. If I need to change the shape of a screwdriver or change the shape of a spanner, for example, just a cheap spanner, heat it up, you can quench it, you can then put it in the oven and go through that whole tempering process and you'll have a really great tool that can't really be done without this. And I've done that with Allen keys, I've done it with spanners. It really is just a really useful tool that once you've got it, you're going to find you're using it a lot. Flywheel pullers, clutch pullers, 3-jaw, 2-jaw, whatever, bearing pullers. Pullers are so useful, and the amount of times that I have seen and heard of people damaging crankshafts, and I have done it myself. Hands up, I've done it myself, and it took me about 3 or 4 hours to rectify. Crankshafts are hardened, so anytime you damage the thread on a crankshaft, have fun trying to file it straight, or file it, not so much fun, you're not going to get a crankshaft straight, not small ones, the general people. Yeah, you might be able to. I digress. If you damage the threads on a crankshaft, have fun fixing it. I've been there. It's an absolute nightmare. Thread files don't cut it. Normal files don't well, they do, but it's really slow. Dremel is the way that I went to fix it. So yes, I had the nut on there and I was smacking it and I couldn't get the flywheel off and the nut had actually started to twist slightly and I damaged the first couple of threads. It was a nightmare. Invest in as many different pullers as you can. Anytime you need to take something off, use a puller. And sometimes you can get ones that are really generic. This one's, I think, from Briggs and Stratton. You just stick it over the crankshaft stub and it's got brass inside there. Yes, I also use a brass hammer. Get yourself a brass hammer when you're working on that if you really have to tap on it. But my best advice is don't hit crankshafts. Take my advice on that one because you're going to be in a whole world of hurt. Just not worth it. Use the right tool for the job, especially in that instance, because it's just going to make your life so much easier. All right, the next really useful tool. Now, I didn't put it in essential because I lasted a little while without it, and when you get a bit of a feel for it, you know what you're going for. Compression tester. If you're going to get a compression tester, my advice is get a good quality one that has a short hose, has a number of different attachments, and has Schrader valves in the hose end that goes into the engine, and also, of course, one that goes into the actual tool itself. This one has 3. It has one in the adapter, one in the hose, one in the gauge. Especially smaller 2-stroke engines, if you're using the larger style automotive with a bigger hose, without the Schrader valves where they need to be, you're going to get really bad readings. So good quality. It can be really helpful in diagnosing. With a bit of time and a bit of feel, you know what you're looking for. But for example, that old Villiers 2-stroke, I thought it had really low compression. It was 145, simply because of the fact that the flywheel and the flywheel was really heavy. Starter recoil, or the kind of the rope area was really big, so I had a lot of leverage, and that made me think, oh, it's really easy to spin. And also, they've got a long stroke. They have quite a large squish band, so using the tool told me straight away, actually, it's not low compression. The compression was awesome, and it was a great diagnostic tool. So there we go. Get that. Useful. Last one in that category is air compressor. Gosh, I had a big air compressor, and I got a letter from the council because neighbours were complaining it was too noisy. Totally get it. They're a real pain. They're so loud. I got a silent air compressor. It's much smaller. Does everything it needs to do for me. I can blow off a quick. Honestly, I don't know how I lasted so long without one. Get one with a long kind of tube here so you can really get into tight areas. I use it all the time, not so much for air tools. I don't have any air tools. I literally just use it for compressed air. So useful, so good, worth investing in a good one. And also get yourself a moisture trap, especially if you're working on delicate electronics or anything like that. It's worth it. I went for an oilless one there. Again, it was just a preference, just what I had. Air compressor, get one, it's worth the investment. Then we have 5 tools that I consider, not I consider, 5 tools that I'm adding in as a bonus because I really like them, use them a lot. Measuring tools. You cannot really get that far using really poor measuring tools, especially over time, their accuracy starts to diminish. My opinion on measuring tools, buy the absolute best you can afford. I've gone for Mitutoyo and pretty much everything in dial indicators. I've got a dial indicator, micrometers, telescopic gauges, small hole gauges. And people think that these aren't accurate. They are incredibly accurate. I can get just as accurate with these as I can with a dial bore gauge. These just take a bit more time and a lot more feel. You have to get used to using them. When you do get used to using them, they are incredibly accurate. So useful, especially for higher performance engines like motocross 2-stroke and 4-stroke motocross bikes, where you really need to have them performing to their best. That's where these sorts of tools really come into their own. But also I've used them on lower performance engines like chainsaws, homeowner equipment, where I want to test or check measurements and make sure things are right, or even just basic things that you just think that otherwise you can't get in there. For example, if we are checking valve guide clearances, small hole gauges are great. And the thing I say with this, I've done a video on them, if you can't use these accurately and you're relying on a dial bore gauge, the dial bore gauge, you can get away with a lot of things, but especially smaller engines, these are absolutely vital. And if you can't be accurate with these, then you're kind of missing out on a big, there's no way you can get a dial bore gauge into a 3mm hole, for example. So learn to use them well. They go a long way. They're affordable, these two are anyway, and super, super useful. Then we have tweezers, hemostats. I use these all the time. Grab yourself a set, get a set of straight ones, bent ones, whatever. Make sure they're nice and long. You will find you're using them constantly. Pinching off hoses, sealing hoses, picking up nuts and bolts that have slipped inside areas. They're just great. Use them all the time, more so than probably any other piece of equipment, really. Loctite. Loctite, I go for 243. Again, really, you kind of think that's a bit of a benign thing to mention, but actually it's so useful, especially on high vibration engines. You only need a drop on the threads, rub 2 screws together, spread that out. Don't worry too much about going crazy on removing old Loctite. I generally find the best way to remove old Loctite is new Loctite. Give it a quick brush with a wire brush or a wire wheel. But I find less is more. There is a point of diminishing returns that happens really quick with trying to clean Loctite off. So of course, if you put some on, you thread it in, you find that it's high resistance or more torque than you'd expect you need to apply. Pull it out, clean it off, double check there's not a bit of Loctite in the bottom or something. But generally, just drop, you only need a tiny bit, and when you take it out, generally it kind of breaks and you can blow it out with some compressed air, and it does a great job. Second to last, thread certs. Now these are just cheap. These are like a few dollars each. However, these thread inserts are going to be much stronger than most of the parent material on the engines that I'm working on, things like aluminium, cast iron, magnesium. So I figured that for general, these are absolutely fine. Maybe for things that are in areas of high compression, like a spark plug, I wouldn't use cheap. I would always go for expensive, good quality thread repair kits. But for the majority of the time, these are absolutely excellent. Worth having on hand. When you have them, you'll use them a lot. Last one, Dremel. I've had a number of Dremels in the past and they kept breaking, so they kept repairing them, but or replacing them. But I decided to go for kind of their top of their line one, and love it. It's helped me so much, especially in my restoration projects where I'm using JB Weld and I want to shape and form things. It's just a wonderful tool. You can use it for so many different things. I can't even begin to start to cover all the things it uses. So there we go. Well, that was a long video. I didn't think it was going to take that long to go through it, but that's my thing. That's my thing. That's what I consider essential, really useful, and a few bonus tools that you think, yeah, they're really good to have around. And I guess my best advice, of course, when we've got spanners and sockets and everything, they're really obvious. We're going to need those regardless. But I think this is a great selection of tools that if you have, you're going to be so appreciative of having them. So there we go, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm sure there's more that I'll end this video and I think, oh, I should have added that, I should have added that. But generally, I think this covers a really broad range of repairs on equipment. And I think we'll leave it there. All right, hope you enjoyed the video. Catch you guys. Bye. Oh, and if you did enjoy it, or well, of course, if you did enjoy it, good. If you would change anything or you'd add something in, let me know, because I'm really curious if you think, oh, I would have added this or I would have added that. Even things like a set of T-handles. T-handles are so useful. You get so much feedback from when you use them. Whereas when you've got things like, of course, ratchets unquestionably have their place, but you start to incur, or you start to lose that kind of tactile feel that you get with less leverage. So there we go. Let us know in the comment section if you change or modify or move things around. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you on the next video. Cheers, guys. Bye.